You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Professor Avi Loeb. Avi Loeb is the Frank B. Bird Junior Professor of Science at Harvard University, Chair of Harvard's Department of Astronomy, Founding Director of Harvard's Black Hole Initiative, and Director of the Institute for Theory and Computation within the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He also chairs the Advisory Committee for the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative, serves as the Science Theory Director for all initiatives of the Breakthrough Prize Foundation, as well as Chair of the Board on Physics and Astronomy of the National Academies. He is the author of 4 books and over 700 scientific papers. He is an elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Physical Society, and the International Academy of Astronautics. In 2012, Time selected Loeb as one of the 25 most influential people in space.
Avi Loeb, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Now, Doctor, there has been a major development in the field of UAP, which the Galileo project is actively working to study. And we'll get to updates on that in a bit. But we have a whistleblower that is claiming from some position of credibility that the U.S. government does indeed have recovered materials from and associated with UAP. If that's the case, then the government needs to turn those over to the scientific community for open study, right?
Yeah, I mean, science makes progress based on evidence or materials that it can examine. And in this case, it's hearsay. What David Grusch talks about is based on documents or what independent people told him. That's not sufficient evidence scientifically. But on the other hand, it guides people in Congress to seek that evidence because apparently even the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office claims that they have never seen any evidence to that effect. So that means that the evidence, if it exists, is hidden from view. And we better expose it because any such debris from an extraterrestrial civilization has nothing to do with national security. Obviously, you can benefit from studying it because you will have an advantage over other nations that do not have that information. But that is really not the right approach. If when we learn that most of the ordinary matter in the universe is hydrogen, that was a PhD thesis by Cecilia Payne-Kopashkin at Harvard, the first one in astronomy, about a century ago. It was published in scientific journals. It was not the privy of the US president to know it. And so anything about the universe, about our cosmic neighborhood, should be knowledge shared by all humans. And that's the right approach. It's simply inappropriate if someone withholds that information when it has nothing to do with national security. It doesn't adhere to national borders because any visitor from far away would not care about how we split geographical territories within Earth. I mean, that makes very little, that is very insignificant from a cosmological point of view. So if there is any truth to what David Grusch is talking about, then we should all know it. And I hope the Congress will take the relevant steps towards making it public. But there is also another possibility that he was provided information that was fabricated because there is a special secret section of government developing very advanced technologies. They invented a story that these are actually extraterrestrial in origin, so that nobody would realize that it was the US government doing it. In order to rule out this possibility, we really have to have access to either the materials or the data that is substantiating that claim.
Of course, it could always be a false flag, a 70 or 80-year false flag, actually, that look at these aliens, but don't look at our stealth fighter, something along those lines.
Exactly.
Or they have recovered something that they can't identify, and maybe they can't even back engineer it if it is technological.
Right. Well, it's possible. There are potentially objects coming from the sky that were not manufactured technologically, and I can imagine objects from interstellar space that do not belong to the solar system entering the solar system. And in fact, we know that if they have roughly a size of a meter, we discovered meteors from interstellar space with my student Amir Siraj of that size. And we estimated that they impact the Earth once a year. I mean, the small size, sub-meter scale, but if you consider a meter scale, it's once a decade. And once a decade is a rather long time. You can't really find it easily unless you realize that it was moving very fast before it impacted the Earth. And we know that at least for two meteors, one from 2014, another one from 2017, that collided with Earth and were moving really fast. And we assigned them as being interstellar. And in fact, we are planning an expedition to the Pacific Ocean this summer to retrieve anything that was left from the first interstellar meteor from 2014. And we hope to be able to figure out what its composition was, because it was tougher in material strength than all other space rocks from the solar system. So that's one way to find the evidence for technological origin, by studying the composition of objects that arrive into the solar system from far away. And in fact, the first interstellar meteor was moving faster than 95% of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. Obviously, there are more small objects than big objects. So when you go down to scales that are much smaller than a meter, there are many impacts almost every year. And if you go to a scale of a meter, it's once per decade. But the US government monitors objects falling from the sky because they want to figure out whether they are rocks, whether they are spy balloons, or perhaps drones or ballistic missiles. They have to know that. So they will be the first to recognize an unusual object if it came from interstellar space. And of course, if it appears unusual, it doesn't mean that it's artificial. It could be originating from an astrophysical natural origin that is quite different than the solar system. For example, if you have two neutron stars colliding, the material that is ejected from the system is rich in neutrons, and you could get fragments that are very dense, made mostly of neutrons, that then decay through radioactivity and make some bullets that are moving with very high material strength. And you can imagine relics from that in interstellar space. You can imagine bullets produced by supernova explosions, when the core of a massive star collapses and then bounces back, ejecting the envelope of the star. You could imagine that in the blast wave that is produced, that is sweeping material from the outside, there is fragmentation into small pieces, and perhaps some interstellar objects are made this way. We just don't know. There might be many different environments that are exotic. The key would be to figure out whether an object like that came from interstellar space is natural or artificial. And one way to do that is through the composition. Another is if you have a relic that is big enough so that you can examine the structure. You know, in my last class at Harvard, I asked the students, suppose we recover a gadget from another civilization and it has buttons on it. Would you press a button? And half of the class said, no way. I mean, we are worried that it will, of any catastrophe that it may cause, and never press a button on an interstellar gadget. The second half of the class said, of course we will. I mean, we are very curious to know what will happen if we press a button. Maybe it's GPT 100 will reveal some important secrets about the universe if we press a button. And then one of the students asked me, and what would you do, Professor Loeb? Would you press the button or not? And I said, well, as a scientist, I would treat it like an intelligent creature that went through a trauma. I will not engage with it physically until I figure it out. So I'll take it to a laboratory and analyze, examine it. So, of course, if you find a big enough piece and you see that it's technological, you can learn much more about it. Now, an interesting question is, when David Grusch talks about crash sites, are they associated with natural or artificial objects that crashed? Because I can imagine space trash that is technological in origin. You know, we produce a lot of trash in space. And Voyager 1 and 2 will, within a billion years, will look like a space trash, and they can collide with a planet and survive to the ground, and then someone will find them. They will not be functional. The other possibility, of course, is a space trash of natural origin. So the question is, how well can the government discriminate between these two possibilities, and maybe they can't.
Well, we don't know anything about their testing methods. We don't know anything about the data collection on any such object. We don't know. So it could just simply be something of mistaken identity. In other words, well, we picked up this piece of slag that's weird, but it's still just a piece of slag somebody made. Or is it actually of technological origin? It seems to me, though, if it's very fragmentary, it's only a chunk of something, it would be very, very difficult to reconstruct what it is based on one chunk of material, if it's technological.
Right.
So you're dealing with, I've made this analogy before, you're dealing with a piece of plastic from a television, but it tells you nothing about the television. It's just a piece of plastic. How?
That's right, because when it collides with the Earth, it basically melts. Just to give you a sense, a meter-size interstellar meteor releases as much energy as the Hiroshima atomic bomb. So it will definitely melt. There would be a huge fireball, and not much could survive that explosion. Of course, it could be hardened if it's technological in origin. We might never know. And the thing about something you find on the ground without noticing it impact the ground is that you don't know at which speed it came. The crater that it produces depends only on the amount of energy that it brings upon impact, and you can trade speed for mass in terms of the total energy. So we don't, unless you see it coming down and you figure out that it's moving very fast, must have been unbound to the sun and could not be, for example, a spacecraft that the humanity sent, you can't really tell its origins. And I would argue that in this context, it's not documents, it's not eyewitness testimonies, it's not people that tell you that there is a section of government studying this that matters. It's really what do they have at their possession. And hopefully this testimony would lead to the release of the information. It's possible that it will embarrass that section of government, because once they release it, as long as it's kept secret, they can make the case that it could be extraterrestrial in origin. Once they release it to the scientific community, there will be an explanation that is rather mundane for this material.
Now, let me ask you an off-the-wall question. So if somebody knocks on your door from the government and they say, look, we do have materials and we'd like your opinion, but you can't talk about it, would you accept or refuse the offer?
I will have to think about it. It depends what it involves. My tendency is to only consider open data, open evidence, so that it can be shared with the rest of the scientific community. It really depends on the context. And the issue that I have with classified data is that if I later collect my own data through the Galileo project, through the expedition that I'm leading, and it turns out that we recover information that is similar to the one that was disclosed to me under secrecy, then I will not be able to discuss it. On the other hand, if I'm not exposed to the classified data, nobody can claim that I'm revealing secrets. So there is a benefit to being open throughout. And that is my tendency. I have never been exposed to any classified information. In fact, today I was asked by an email, how come my work on Oumuamua coincided with the New York Times report in December 2017? Was it the government that alerted me to the possibility that Oumuamua might have been technological in origin? And I explained no, because Oumuamua was discovered in October 19th, 2017. And shortly afterwards, I was very intrigued because I wrote a paper a decade earlier forecasting that we should not expect any rocks from other planetary systems to be discovered by the Pan-STARRS telescope that found Oumuamua. And so that was intriguing, that it found something from interstellar space. And then this object looked so weird. It had a very extreme shape. It was reflecting more than expected and didn't have a cometary tail. And so altogether, I was intrigued and immediately initiated a plan to observe it in the radio to see if it's artificial in origin. It turns out that a few weeks before the New York Times article, there was an article in Scientific American that talked about my suggestion that this object might be artificial. So clearly no correlation whatsoever with the government. But it is interesting that this testimony by David Grusch comes just just before we are about to embark in this expedition to the Pacific Ocean to search for the relics of the first interstellar meteor. So, if someone else is inspired by my work, God bless them. I'm glad that the more people are talking or looking for such relics, the better. But definitely, I'm following my own ideas as an independent scientist, and I'm really reluctant to sacrifice that freedom for the benefit of looking at the classified data.
Oumuamua does not work on federal government schedules unless it either wants taxes or otherwise. But if it had, it would have been moving much, much more slowly. When does the expedition happen? How far off are we?
It will be this summer, so there will be a diary that I will maintain on medium.com where I will report about the whereabouts of this expedition and where we are and whether we are finding anything. It's a very challenging task because the ocean is a mile deep at that location, and we are talking about many kilometers in size. And so we are, if indeed the object melted into tiny droplets, they should be millimeter in size. And it's very challenging to collect them after a decade from the ocean floor. But we developed the machinery, and we have the very best people in the world for such expeditions. So I'm very excited about it, and we'll do our best. And of course, my concern is that we will find only plastics from humans in the ocean, because by the year 2050, there will be more mass in plastics than mass in fish in the ocean. So just be careful when you order fish at a restaurant in the year 2050, because it will probably contain plastics in its belly. So I'm very hopeful that aside from plastics and aside from volcanic ashes that may very well be out there, we will be able to identify new types of particles that were left over from the meteor at the location of the meteor. That, of course, the way to discriminate them is that we will find them only where we expect the meteor to have fragmented rather than in a control sample somewhere else. And we will allocate several weeks for this expedition. It will be very exhaustive, and we'll do our best. We also have a second meteor that we're planning to follow on, and whatever we retrieve in terms of a sample will be brought back to Harvard College Observatory. I secured a place to put it, such that if any scientific team around the world is interested in analyzing it, we can loan it to them. But we will be in full control. And this is a scientific mission. It has no commercial value. And of course, if we find any gadget, I will put it on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City.
What are the protocols for when you find something? Now, I want to note here that this is not the first time this has happened. The NOAA has actually recovered a meteorite or meteorite material from the ocean floor before. So there's a good chance that you'll come back with something here. Once you find something coming up off the ocean floor, what are your protocols for isolation and keeping it from contamination and all that? What's the plan for that?
Right. So I wrote a memo to all team members in which I explained that we need to follow a very strict protocol where I will be in charge authorizing any use of the sample that we collect, but there will always be at least two members of the team present whenever material is added or taken away from the box. And we want to avoid any suspicion that there was salting of the sample by someone, and just to maintain the scientific integrity of this project. And once we bring it back, I have a group of experts at Harvard University that I solicited, and they have access to the best instruments that can analyze the composition. And anything we find will be made public, and you will know about it, and we will publish it in scientific journals that are peer reviewed. This is a team effort. It's the expedition itself costs about $1.5 million, and I received the donation that allowed this funding. And if we are successful, we will continue searching for more interstellar meteors. And the advantage of this search is that we know the object was moving really fast, such that it couldn't have been bound to the sun. And the first meteor was actually moving faster than 95% of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. So it moved at more than 60 kilometers per second outside the solar system. And Of course, that would be a natural consequence of some propulsion that it may have had if it was a spacecraft.
Now, to go back to the recent controversy over materials that have been recovered, say the government says, all right, you want to see them? This is what we have. Dr. Loeb analyzed these. Is the Galileo project ready or could be made ready to study materials of potentially alien origin handed over by the US government?
Yes, we do have the machinery. For example, even on the boat, we will have what is called an XRF, an X-ray fluorescence device, where that shines X-rays on the sample and from the scintillations can tell what the composition is. But once we bring it to Harvard, there are many other instruments, state-of-the-art instruments that can allow us to analyze those materials. And we definitely have the expertise and the instrumentation necessary to examine materials. In the case of the rest of the Galileo project, we are using primarily cameras in the infrared, optical, radio, and then we have audio sensors that are looking at the sky for objects moving through the sky. So that's not necessarily learning about their material composition, but just trying to look for objects that are different from birds, natural objects, different from drones, balloons, or spacecraft, or rockets, or airplanes that are human made. And we don't really expect anything. We don't need to understand extraterrestrial technologies in order to find them. All we need to do is exclude the possibility that they might be natural or human made. That's all. And then, of course, the second question is, okay, well, they don't look in terms of their maneuvering capabilities, in terms of their images, if they don't look like natural or human made objects that are terrestrial, then the next step is to learn what they are. And if you can't put your hands on them, then perhaps we need higher resolution images and monitoring them more carefully. And that's the whole advantage of having a systematic study, because you're not dependent on anecdotal reports that were unexpected, the way that the Aero is studying right now. All these reports from the past cannot be revisited. The instruments that were used were not calibrated, were not under full control. They just accidentally saw something unusual. And you can analyze that data, and it will never be conclusive because you can't revisit it, you can't reconstruct it, unless it's very high quality to start with. Perhaps then you can say something. In fact, Sean Kirkpatrick, at his congressional testimony, said that they have two teams, one of intelligence experts, the other one of scientists and engineers that are analyzing each of these events. And more recently, he said that 2 to 5% of all the UAP, the unidentified anomalous phenomena, are truly anomalous. The rest are probably balloons, drones, objects that they can figure out. And so we're talking, if they have more than 800 such reports by now, we're talking only about several tenths of them being truly anomalous. And the question is, what are they? But if it's past reports, we can't really get more data. So you're sort of stuck when you deal with anecdotal past reports. It's much better to do a systematic study with instruments that are calibrated, that you have full control over. We have that. In the Galileo project, we have one observatory operating right now as we speak and collecting data 24/7. And we analyze the data with artificial intelligence software. And then over the past couple of weeks, I was in contact with people who are willing to fund 5 additional copies of the first observatory, placing them in different locations. So that's very encouraging. And the hope is to make tens of those copies, maybe 100, so that we will get very good statistics within a year or two on unidentified anomalous phenomena and figure out what is the true nature of those rare events that Sean Kirkpatrick calls truly anomalous. So instead of asking the government to do it for us, which is really the lazy approach, you can sit on your chair and say, I think this is that, or I have an opinion, and why don't I press on the government to declassify that? Well, that has been the approach in the past, but it didn't lead us anywhere. And a much better approach is for us to collect our own data that is open to the public, and hopefully we'll figure out what these objects are.
Now, on placement of these sensors and the 5 new sensors, that's quite a leap, actually, one observatory to 6. How do you define the placement of them? Do you actually go and look at data that, I don't know, MUFON or somebody like that says, there's a hot spot here that people are seeing or reporting a lot of stuff? Or do you have a much more neutral way of doing it? In other words, distribute them evenly or something like that? What's the methodology there?
Yeah, we do have a subcommittee within the Galileo project looking into past reports. And the one thing you find is that the rate of reports is correlated with population density. It's also correlated with special holidays. During the 4th of July, you have many more reports. Basically, what it tells you is that the more eyes are looking at the sky, the more reports you get. That will be a natural consequence of having balloons, for example, everywhere. The director of national intelligence said in the latest 2022 report to Congress about UAP that they believe about half of them are balloons. And the US government later on shut down 4 such objects. Obviously, I'm happy that they shoot down some balloons and they identify half of them to be balloons because it reduces the clutter in the sky for the Galileo project. I mean, as a scientist, I really don't care about any human made objects out there, and balloons make up a substantial fraction of them. So we will have always to filter out those obvious targets that are out there. And we are also using satellite data from Planet Labs and looking down on Earth, especially in areas that are not very heavily populated. Because if there are these UAPs, they might be everywhere. And then you have less confusion in, for example, the Sahara Desert or in the South Pole, Antarctica.
Now, what struck you about Grusch's testimony, or what he's saying publicly? I guess we don't get to see the testimony that he made to Congress or anything like that. But what struck you about that as being worth calling the government out and saying, "Hey, show us these materials"?
Yeah, so I think it was very credible. What he said was verified, and Inspector General also referred to it seriously. And so my impression is it was reported properly. There was no exaggeration. What he said is what he heard. He did not invent anything. There was no fantasies in his report. The only fundamental question is whether the people that informed him do not really know what they're talking about, or maybe know what they're talking about, but just fabricate a story for him to believe. Okay, so what is the source, the primary source of information in this case? And I wouldn't be surprised if it's all a story. I wouldn't be surprised because there might be sections of government that want to plant stories in the public domain, for other countries to believe in, until I see the evidence. So that's the fundamental question. And of course, there is a possibility that he's referring to something real, and it's the task of the US Congress to get a hold of it and then let the American people know. And it would be amazing to figure it out. My fundamental belief is that government does not have conspiracies, that it's much more likely to be incompetent. So if I were to imagine what's behind this is that they did retrieve something, but this something has an origin that is not clear. They call it extraterrestrial, but they don't really know what it is. And it's not as if it's a device that is functional. And then, the story builds up within government around it, but doesn't necessarily mean that, indeed we have access to a craft from another civilization. That would be my simplest interpretation. But on the other hand, it may well be that they were hiding it. So the only way to figure it out is for them to show us the evidence rather than us speculating about it, or for us to find similar evidence on our own. There is no reason why the US government should be the only agency finding those things if they came from very large distances, tens of thousands of light years away. And the only reason that it would be the first organization to find them is because the scientific community was ridiculing this subject and saying that even extraordinary claim requires an extraordinary evidence. But the point is, if you're not seeking the evidence, then you will never find it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, I don't think that an extraterrestrial intelligence is an extraordinary claim. I think it's the other way around, because I don't think that we are special or unique or privileged. I think the fundamental assumption should be that things like us existed billions of years ago. They could have sent space probes that would have arrived to us by now. And to find out, we just need to look at our backyard, whether there are any objects that arrived from our cosmic neighborhood.
The von Neumann 3D printer. If you want to cross vast distances of space, all you need is time. And if you're a computer, you don't care about time so much. So you can then cover the entire galaxy with 3D printers in just a few million years at sublight speeds.
Right. So that's an approach that doesn't require to launch too many probes yourself. But I calculated that, we are currently investing $2 trillion a year in military budgets. If we were to listen to the words of John Lennon, imagine all the people living in peace, and we would allocate the surplus to space exploration, $2 trillion a year. Then by the end of this century, we can send a probe towards every star in the Milky Way galaxy. We have the means to do that within 1 century. So all you need is one civilization out there. If you roll the dice of technology billions of times on planets similar to the Earth, surely there could have been one civilization that did that. And we can find their relics, because it takes less than 1 billion years to traverse the entire Milky Way galaxy. So if they formed billions of years before us, the relics should be all around us. And whether they will be functional devices or space trash remains to be seen. And potentially crashes on Earth may be just space trash, or this meteor that I'm going after, because it was not maneuvering beyond just colliding with Earth. But there could also be functional devices. And if you imagine a civilization that is more advanced than just sending a probe towards every star, what they can do is send fewer probes that replicate themselves, and sort of like dandelion seeds, that one seed gives rise to a dandelion flower that produces many more seeds. And so it could be an exponential process once you start it. And that could be a very efficient method of basically seeding the entire Milky Way galaxy with whatever you want, if you have 3D printers with AI. So we don't know if there was an interstellar gardener that seeded our neighborhood with probes. And rather than have an opinion, let's just check.
Let's hope that they are dandelions and not outright invasive weeds. Now, you could, in principle, if you had such a device that has populated the galaxy, von Neumann style, and it's printing out, if it can self-replicate, it can print out anything. So it's printing out UAP that are checking in on a particularly interesting inhabited exoplanet like Earth. It could also, in principle, print out an organism, right? Like a living organism, an alien, so to speak. It could actually print that out in principle, right?
Yeah, in principle, what we're talking about is similar to biology. In fact, von Neumann came with the idea of automata, self-replicating machines that do not produce the same identical copy every generation. He imagined updating the information every generation, which is similar to what nature does with mutations. And he did that. He came with the idea a year before the double helix structure of the DNA was discovered. We now know that nature, biology, does exactly that. Make copies with modifications to the information that is transferred from one generation to the next. And you can imagine technological devices imitating nature, imitating biology in a way that is more suitable to interstellar travel, because, as I mentioned before, biology needs water, at least life as we know it needs water. It also cannot survive very long under bombardment by energetic particles, cosmic rays in interstellar space. So what you might want to do is develop technologies that can be hardened, can survive the journey, are not getting bored. You don't need them to replicate while they're traveling. Only when they get to their destination, to a planet, they can use the raw materials there to make many more copies and send them elsewhere. And that would be a very efficient way of growing exponentially in terms of the number of seeds that are planted within the Milky Way galaxy. And if only one civilization realized that, that would be sufficient, that within a few billion years, the entire Milky Way galaxy will be full of whatever they planted. And they could potentially produce biological life as well, although many scientists believe that it happened randomly on Earth. There is still the possibility of panspermia, the transfer of life. And there is a natural origin for that. We know that there was a Martian rock that was analyzed about 20 years ago to have survived the journey from Mars without getting heated to more than 40 degrees, about the freezing temperature of water, 40 degrees Celsius. And therefore, if it had life in it, if there were tiny microbes in it, tiny astronauts, they could have survived the journey. And you could have brought life to Earth from Mars. This rock demonstrates that possibility, although there wasn't any life found in it that came from Mars. But because Mars lost its atmosphere. But early on in Mars, it had liquid water. So it could have been the case that life started on Mars and was brought to Earth, and we are all Martians. And when Elon Musk talks about dying on Mars, it's just like a kid that wants to go back to his family home, childhood home, and die there. We don't know if we started on Mars. Another thing to keep in mind is Mars lost its atmosphere about 2 billion years ago at the middle of its lifespan. And if life advanced twice as fast on Mars than on Earth before it lost its atmosphere, then there could have been creatures like us on Mars when it still had liquid water. And how can we find out? Well, one way to find out is to go into the caves on the Martian landscape. These are lava tubes, and check if there are any markings on the walls or maybe skeletons hidden there, because the environment in those caves, in those lava tubes, were protected from cosmic rays, from impact by asteroids. I calculated that over the past 2 billion years, every square kilometer was impacted by asteroids on Mars because there was no atmosphere. With the amount of energy that was released for every square kilometer is like 20 Hiroshima atomic bombs. So anything on the surface would have been ground to dust. We cannot find any relic from it. But under the ground, in those caves, lava tubes, perhaps we would find some evidence for early life, maybe early human-like creatures over there.
That's interesting. So it is in principle possible, or at least we can't rule it out, that there may have been a faster developing civilization on Mars that may have left evidence, but we can't find it because it's been pulverized on the surface. But if we go below the surface, we might find an artifact. Or, alternately, some passing alien civilization decided to leave some sort of tombstone or message on the moon, where it will just sit there.
Right. I mean, all you need for that to happen is that intelligent life started on Mars twice as fast as on Earth, which is not a crazy number. A factor of 2 is not astronomical. So we have never searched in those. Instead, NASA sends those probes like the Perseverance rover to the surface and collects a sample and throws it on the ground. And then we have to wait a decade before it might return to Earth. And that's not really the right approach. We need to send probes into those lava tubes. We need to take a sample of the soil and put a drop of water in it and look at it with a microscope. There are different approaches for searching for life rather than the way it was done so far.
Now, one thing we know is that there is a crashed flying saucer on Mars because we put it there. And it was crashed deliberately because it was frivolous. It had served its purpose, so it just flies off and goes off on its own and crashes. Is it possible that that's what we're seeing with UAP, and specifically these claims of crashes, that it's actually used material that's being discarded?
Yeah, definitely. That could be the case, or it could be material that belongs to a technological object that is not functioning anymore. So either it was done on purpose or by chance because this object is not functioning anymore. I should say that a very effective rocket fuel is water, because if you break the water using an electric current that, for example, you can make out of sunlight using the photoelectric effect, if you break the water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen, then you can use the hydrogen or oxygen to fuel a rocket. That's why finding water on the moon or Mars could be as important as finding oil on Earth. It could fuel the economies there. The other advantage of following the water is that you might find evidence for life frozen in the water, ice that you find on Mars or elsewhere where there used to be liquid water. And once again, I come back to these lava tubes because inside of them, it's possible that there are still some organisms that are frozen inside a solid ice that we can find. So I think there is a lot to explore even within the solar system about life beyond Earth that we haven't done. And asking where is everybody without even looking through a telescope or without checking our backyard for objects or without going to the cosmic street near us and looking around, that is really presumptuous. Elon Musk was saying in an interview just last month, he said, I'm a space guy. I know everything about space and I haven't seen any evidence for aliens. And to me, that was a remarkable statement because, the region that Elon Musk explored is just around the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And it's a quadrillion times smaller than the size of the observable universe. It's sort of like the ratio between the size of the head of a pin and the distance to the most distant planet in the solar system. So imagine an ant that is exploring the head of a pin and tries to make a statement about the outer planets in the solar system. It must be a very presumptuous ant. So Elon Musk saying, I don't see evidence for aliens just because he looked around here, that is really inappropriate, especially since he hasn't been searching. And my whole point is there might be small objects. Objects need to be bigger than a football field in order for us to detect them within the orbit of the Earth around the sun by reflection of sunlight. We've never launched. Even Starship is not as big as a football field. So we can't see objects smaller than that, and there might be a lot of them, many more than 100 meters in size. We are really at the beginning. Only over the past decade, we found the first interstellar objects. And in my forthcoming book, Interstellar, I discuss the implications, the benefits for humanity. I'm an optimist. I believe that in self-fulfilling prophecies. And so if we believe in a better future, we might actually realize it. And one way to inspire us is by finding evidence for other civilizations that went through the same technological evolution as we did. And if we look at what they produced, it will give us a glimpse at our future, something that we can aspire to be.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, people have always predicted apocalyptic damage to society by knowing that alien civilizations exist. I don't see it. They say it'll collapse the world's religions, but most of them allow for it. They allow for the idea, or they don't mention it at all.
Well, there should be some sense of natural selection in interstellar space. Many civilizations probably perished. They came to exist and then died, either because of self inflicted wounds. Just imagine some of the world wars not ending the way we ended them, or a pandemic that is much more catastrophic than COVID-19, or some nuclear war, or maybe some AI misbehaving in ways that are catastrophic. So the point about longevity in interstellar space is that it's given to those who are not subjected to a single point catastrophe, to those civilizations that decide to venture into space and spread their seeds in many locations so that they will not disappear. And it's up to us to decide whether we want such a future. Within a billion years, just 20% of the age of the Earth, the sun will boil off all the oceans on Earth. So we will not survive. And obviously, other planets around stars that formed billions of years before the sun, those habitable planets that look like Earth, were already sterilized. And there must have been cries for help from those civilizations that perished on those planets. There must have been spacecraft living in an exodus. A lot of biological creatures wanted to leave the planet. There was not enough room for everyone. But we were not around if it happened billions of years ago, and we couldn't hear those cries for help. And my guess is there must be a lot of such civilizations that were not advanced enough to leave their planet. They died, when the star evolved, when some supernova exploded nearby, when a black hole became extremely bright by accreting a cloud of gas in their vicinity. Many tragedies in cosmic history that we are not aware of. So then you ask yourself, who survived? Well, those that survived, those that arrived to our backyard, are probably the successful ones. They were selected to maintain their longevity, and we can learn from them. And we didn't reach them. We didn't even exit the solar system. We are currently, our most advanced spacecraft that are heading towards interstellar space, they only reached 0.1% of the size of the solar system. They still have 1,000 times larger distance to go through before they will exit to interstellar space. So that's where we are. And if we find something from someone else, then it would likely represent technologies that are far superior to ours because they had the benefit of billions of years ahead of us.
Is it in principle possible, and to go into sci-fi author mode, is it in principle possible to have technological panspermia? Or in other words, could the beginning of life on Earth, abiogenesis, have been artificial and we are one of the seeds? Of course, evolution and evolutionary processes take over from there, and it goes in all sorts of different directions. But the very first beginnings of life, could that have been artificially planted?
Definitely, that's a possibility. Of course, it doesn't solve the origin of life because you still had the gardener, the question about the gardener, where did it come from? And someone must have, it's like the chicken and the egg problem. Someone must have started the process, okay? So, but it is possible that life was seeded on Earth. For example, just to give you an example, around the time that Mars lost its atmosphere, Earth developed oxygen, large quantities of oxygen in its atmosphere. Obviously, that oxygen was produced by cyanobacteria, but it's not clear what triggered that very sharp rise in the abundance of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. What triggered the cyanobacteria to change the composition of the atmosphere? Without the oxygen, we wouldn't exist. Complex animals wouldn't to be there. So it's still an open question, and you can imagine someone triggering just the change in the composition of the Earth's atmosphere because they already know that this leads to more complex animals, and perhaps they decided to trigger that. There are many ways to change the history of life on a planet, and I went through an interesting sequence of factors of 10 in terms of our history. So 5 years ago, GPT-1 was introduced by OpenAI, and it contained about 100 million parameters. Today, GPT-4 has 1 million times more parameters. The capabilities are growing exponentially. 50 years ago, 10 times farther back, the final mission of NASA's Apollo program, Apollo 17, had humans setting foot on the moon. 500 years ago, Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that planets orbit the sun and the Earth is not at the center of the universe. 5,000 years ago, human history was recorded for the first time. 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa and replaced the indigenous Neanderthals in Europe. And then 10 times farther back, Neanderthals originated from Africa. And then 5 million years ago, the last split between humans and the chimpanzees, bonobos, took place. And it gave humans 23 pairs of chromosomes compared to 24 for apes. 10 times farther back, around 66 million years ago, a 10-kilometer asteroid the size of Manhattan Island hit the Earth and extinguished 3/4 of all species on Earth. 10 times farther back, 500 million years ago, Earth went through the Cambrian explosion of species when all major animals started to appear. And then 5 billion years ago, the sun formed out of the collapse of a gas cloud. And then I asked my class when I mentioned it to them, what happened 50 billion years ago, 10 times farther back? They didn't know. What we do know is that the universe did not exist 50 billion years ago. We don't know what preceded it.
We may never know, and that's a whole subject in and of itself. But
Well, it could have been created in the laboratory of quantum engineers. Once we will have unification of quantum mechanics and gravity, we might understand how to create a universe in the laboratory. An interesting feature about our universe is if you take a small region in this expanding universe, the energy associated with the expansion, the kinetic energy of the expansion, is exactly equal and opposite in sign to the gravitational binding energy. So it sort of has zero energy, and perhaps it's possible to create such baby universes in the laboratory out of nothing without investing too much. But we don't really know. We don't know the conditions necessary to make baby universes because we don't have a predictive theory of quantum gravity. Another civilization might have it. And if we realize that our universe was created by another civilization, then it's sort of like making babies that can give birth to new babies, new generation, and that will solve the origin of the Big Bang problem.
I think it would be the ultimate comeback of the Copernican principle if it turns out that someone had created this universe in order to escape a dying universe, and we are just a byproduct of that. We're just an accident.
Well, but the amazing thing is it gives us an inspiration to create more universes. So, the story never ends, and we are up to a brilliant future, if we create life in a baby universe that we made in our laboratories.
That would make existence all the more amazing. Now, I have two last questions for you before we run out of time. The first is, any candidates yet from the observatory sitting on top of Harvard?
We have not seen yet anything that looks truly anomalous. And I just asked before we started to speak, I had a Zoom conversation with my postdoc, and I asked him to let me know if he sees anything, because he is analyzing the data that we get from the observatory. So far, I have nothing to report about truly anomalous objects. But of course, once we see something, we'll write a paper about it that will be made public. We will not hide it.
All you need is one. Now, my last question is, do you think that we are at a turning point with this revelation that maybe there are materials to study that we can lobby the government to show us? Do you think this is the turning point where we start to take close technosignatures very seriously?
Well, I was asked this morning, every day I have of order 5 to 10 interviews and requests for me to write things. And so this morning I was asked by Wired magazine to make a prediction for 2024. And I said that it's quite possible that within a year we will have indisputable evidence for technologically manufactured objects that came from outside of this Earth, from another civilization, from interstellar space. And the reason I say that is because I will be leading an expedition to the Pacific Ocean looking for that. There is the Galileo project collecting data. And there is this possibility that David Grusch was speaking about something that really exists, that there are materials, there is clear evidence for something that the government keeps secret. And my hope is that in the 2024 State of the Union address of President Biden, he will talk not just about the state of the union, but also about the state of the universe. And will say, fellow Americans, we are not alone.
I think we are in for a very interesting year indeed. Dr. Loeb, thank you once again for checking in with us. And I look forward to watching this unfold and having future conversations with you about it.
My pleasure.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.